So the mob silenced him. What we know is a car pulled up, a door opened, Hoffa got in. They drove away, and it's where the trail of Hoffa ends.
He was the voice of the blue-collar man, bold, fearless, and untouchable.
I stand here today before you as I stood in front of that court and took an oath that I was not then guilty, nor am I guilty now.
But Jimmy Hoffa's rise came with dangerous friends, pulling him deep into the Mafia's shadow, where every deal carried a price. Then, one afternoon, he simply vanished. No witnesses, no body, just questions that haunted America for half a century.
Jimmy Hoffa disappeared almost a half-century ago. Fitting that the Union leader's middle name was Riddle, because no one's been able to solve where he is or how he died.
Now, decades later, former mob boss Michael Franzese breaks his silence, revealing what really happened the day Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. The Union boss who controlled America's bloodstream. Jimmy Hoffa could stop a city from eating breakfast. One phone call from Detroit and milk trucks would park, bread wouldn't reach stores, and eggs would rot in warehouses. By 1974, Hoffa commanded 2.2 million Teamsters who moved everything Americans touched, wore, or consumed. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters had become the circulatory system of North American commerce, and Hoffa controlled every heartbeat. Teamster truckers hauled 94% of manufactured goods across state lines and delivered 78% of America's food supply. Every construction site needed Teamster concrete mixers. Every factory needed Teamster freight handlers. When Sears wanted to stock shelves for Christmas, they negotiated with Hoffa. When General Motors needed parts for assembly lines, they called Hoffa. But Hoffa's real power wasn't intimidation. The 5'5" Union boss could walk into any loading dock and talk to workers like he was one of them, because he had been. Drivers would take bullets for him because he'd gotten them health insurance, pension plans, and wages that let them buy houses instead of renting rooms. The Central States Pension Fund started simple. Every Teamster contributed a few dollars from each paycheck for retirement. By 1960, the fund held $200 million. By 1975, $1.6 billion. This wasn't money sitting in a vault. This was liquid cash, available immediately with one signature. Jimmy Hoffa's signature, the mob noticed. Santo Trafficante in Florida, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and the Detroit Partnership understood what that money represented. Traditional banks asked questions and demanded collateral. The pension fund just needed Hoffa's approval. Want to build a casino in Las Vegas? Hoffa could arrange a $20 million loan by lunch. Need a golf course in Miami? The pension fund had you covered. The partnership worked perfectly. When strikes threatened Hoffa's control, mob muscle shut them down. When rival unions tried poaching Teamster territory, their offices mysteriously burned. When prosecutors got too close, witnesses disappeared or developed memory problems. The mob provided violence, Hoffa provided respectability and endless cash. It was capitalism stripped to its brutal essence. The fatal mistake, Hoffa threatens to expose everything. Richard Nixon needed the Teamsters in 1960. The Union had backed him against Kennedy, pouring money and manpower into a campaign that lost by 0.17%. Hoffa spent the next decade in courtrooms, fighting Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department with expensive lawyers paid by the pension fund. When they finally got him in 1967 for jury tampering and pension fraud, Hoffa went to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary believing Nixon owed him. The deal came in December 1971. Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence from 13 years to time served, but there was a catch. Hoffa couldn't participate in Union activities until March 1980. He'd be 67, 9 years removed from power, forgotten. Nixon got Teamster support for his 1972 re-election. The mob got something better. Frank Fitzsimmons smiled constantly and never said no to men carrying guns. Hoffa had picked him as acting president because he seemed harmless. But Fitzsimmons discovered he liked private jets, $100 dinners, and the respect that came with controlling billions. The mob discovered they liked him even more. Under Hoffa, getting pension fund money required negotiations and careful politics. Under Fitzsimmons, you just asked nicely. Loans Hoffa rejected got approved. Interest rates dropped from 8% to 3%. Repayment schedules became suggestions. By 1974, federal investigators found $400 million had vanished into shell companies in Panama, the Caymans, and Switzerland. The money built casino empires, bought politicians, and funded operations the FBI still can't fully trace. Hoffa watched from Detroit and burned. He started making calls to old allies, promising war when 1980 arrived. Not legal challenges, real exposure. He knew which pension fund loans went to which mob families, which politicians took bribes, where the bodies were buried. During a July 1975 meeting with supporters, Hoffa laid out his plan: return to power and clean house, no matter who got hurt. Word traveled fast in mob circles. Family leaders met and someone asked what to do about Hoffa. The answer was simple and unanimous: you make the problem disappear. July 30th, 1975. The last phone call. The parking lot of the Machus Red Fox restaurant shimmered with heat at 2 o'clock that Wednesday afternoon. Jimmy Hoffa sat in his 1974 Pontiac Granville, green with a black vinyl top, watching the restaurant entrance. The meeting was supposed to fix everything. Anthony Giacalone, whom everyone called Tony Jack, had arranged it personally. Giacalone ran Detroit's east side like a feudal kingdom, collecting tribute from every illegal card game, every numbers runner, every prostitute working Gratiot Avenue. But he and Hoffa went back to the 1940s, when they were both young men fighting for territory in a city that manufactured half of America's cars. Tony Jack vouched for the meeting, said it would settle the beef with Tony Pro once and for all. The problem with Tony Provenzano started in Lewisburg prison. Hoffa and Tony Pro, captain in the Genovese family and head of Teamsters Local 560, served time in the same cell block. The stories vary about what triggered their hatred. Some say Tony Pro wanted $1 million pension fund loan for a casino deal, and Hoffa refused. Others claim it was a prison yard fight over a basketball game where Hoffa called Tony Pro a cheat in front of other inmates. The ugliest version involves Tony Pro threatening to kidnap Hoffa's granddaughter. By 2:30 p.m., the parking lot held 43 cars. Witnesses later told FBI agents they remembered seeing Hoffa because he looked out of place, dressed like he was heading to a business meeting while everyone else wore golf shirts and shorts. At 2:45, Hoffa called his wife Josephine at their Lake Orion home and told her he was coming home. Hoffa never made it home. His car was discovered the next morning, doors unlocked, no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing missing except Hoffa himself. Michael Franzese's bombshell. When Michael Franzese talks about organized crime, people listen, not because he's loud, not because he's guessing, but because for 2 decades he was the mob's most sophisticated earner since Al Capone, a guy who understood spreadsheets better than violence and used that knowledge to steal $300 million a year from the government. The kind of guy who actually knew how the families operated at the highest levels. So when he sat down in 2023 and said he knew exactly what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, it wasn't mob mythology. It was something closer to testimony. Franzese wasn't your typical street thug who got made because his father knew somebody. His father was John Sonny Franzese, underboss of the Colombo family, who did 50 years in federal prison. But Michael went to college, understood spreadsheets better than most CFOs, and figured out how to steal gasoline taxes through 18 shell companies that dissolved before the IRS knew they existed. By 1985, he was bringing in $8 million a week. The gasoline scheme was brilliant. Set up a company, sell gas to stations, collect state and federal taxes that came to about 40 cents per gallon, then declare bankruptcy before paying the government. Start a new company the next day and repeat. Franzese ran this operation across New York, New Jersey, and Florida, stealing an estimated $1 billion before prosecutors caught up. When Franzese walked away from the mob in 1989, something that's supposed to be impossible without dying, he took secrets that could destroy what was left of the 5 families. During a 2023 interview, he revealed that the order to eliminate Hoffa came directly from New York, not from the Patriarca family in New England, where Hoffa supposedly had protection. The shooter, according to Franzese, was still alive when he made this claim. Even more explosive, Franzese said he possessed audio tapes recorded by someone close to the triggerman. Tapes that reveal details about the disappearance that have never been made public. Then he dropped a cryptic hint about the body and said, "It's wet." That one word might explain why 50 years of digging found nothing. Lake Michigan sits 40 minutes from where Hoffa disappeared. The Detroit River flows into Lake Erie. Dozens of abandoned quarries filled with water dot the landscape between Detroit and New Jersey. If Hoffa went into deep water that night, weighted down properly, he's never coming back. Sally Bugs, the violent enforcer who knew too much. Salvatore Briguglio had the kind of reputation that made other hitmen nervous. They called him Sally Bugs, though nobody was stupid enough to say it to his face. As Tony Provenzano's personal enforcer for the Genovese family, Sally Bugs handled problems that required more than threatening phone calls. He was responsible for at least 8 deaths that the FBI knew about, probably 3 times that many they didn't. The FBI had Sally Bugs at the top of their suspect list within days of Hoffa's disappearance. He'd been spotted in Detroit on July 30th, unusual since he rarely left New Jersey. Witnesses placed him near the Machus Red Fox that morning. The theory goes that Sally pulled the trigger on Hoffa, then brought the body back to Jersey. The Genovese family had a proven method for making problems disappear. Brother Moscato's dump in Jersey City, a landfill where bodies went in and questions didn't come out. 3 years later, on March 21, 1978, Sally Bugs walked out of Andrea's restaurant in Little Italy after dinner with his brother. 2 men approached from behind and rained bullets on him. The shooters disappeared into the evening crowd while Sally Bugs bled out in front of tourists. The shooting happened 2 weeks before he was scheduled to testify in front of a grand jury about pension fund fraud. Whatever Sally Bugs knew died with him, but someone else had been watching that night in 1975. Paul Capella Jr. waited 46 years to tell his story. His father, Paul Sr., worked at Brother Moscato's dump, the same landfill the Genovese family used. According to Paul Jr., he watched as a 12-year-old while men brought a 55-gallon steel drum to the dump after midnight on July 31, 1975. His father helped lower it into a hole near the Pulaski Skyway. The drum had been welded shut and wrapped in chains. One of the men told his father it contained something that can never be found. The FBI brought ground-penetrating radar to the site in October 2021. They drilled test holes 20 feet down, looking for any trace of human decomposition. The search took 3 days and cost taxpayers $400,000. They found nothing. Either Paul Jr. had the wrong spot, or someone moved the drum before investigators arrived, or the whole story was another dead end in a case full of them. Michael Franzese doesn't buy the Jersey theory. Why drive a body all the way from Detroit to New Jersey? It's a long drive across state lines, with every mile increasing the chance of getting pulled over for a broken taillight or a random traffic stop. You don't transport evidence that could put you on death row across half the country. It makes no sense. Whatever happened to Hoffa, Franzese believes it happened close to where he disappeared. The foster son's betrayal, Chucky O'Brien's Mercury. Charles Chucky O'Brien called Jimmy Hoffa dad for 35 years. When O'Brien's mother died in 1943, Hoffa took the 18-year-old into his home, gave him work at the union, and treated him like blood. O'Brien stood as best man at Hoffa's family weddings, played with Hoffa's grandchildren, and had keys to every property Hoffa owned, which made the FBI's discovery 3 weeks after the disappearance particularly devastating. The maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis belonged to Joey Giacalone, Tony Jack's son. O'Brien had borrowed it on July 30th, claiming he needed to run errands. When FBI forensic teams processed the car with a new technology called gas chromatography, they found something that changed everything. 3 human hairs caught in the fabric of the back seat. DNA testing wouldn't exist for another decade, but microscopic analysis matched the hairs to samples from Hoffa's hairbrush. They also found traces of blood, type O positive, Hoffa's blood type, though too degraded to prove identity conclusively. The FBI brought O'Brien in for questioning 17 times. His story changed with each interview. First, he was at the Union Hall all afternoon. Then he was getting a car washed. Then he was delivering salmon to a friend's wife. James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's son, confronted O'Brien at their father's funeral service, held without a body a week after the disappearance. James grabbed O'Brien by the shoulders and demanded to know what happened. According to witnesses, O'Brien's face went white. He mumbled something about not knowing anything, then literally ran to his car and drove away. They never spoke again. The FBI's theory was simple and horrible. Hoffa trusted O'Brien completely. If O'Brien had pulled up in Joey Giacalone's Mercury and said the meeting had been moved to a house for privacy, Hoffa would have gotten in without question. He would have sat in that back seat, maybe made small talk, never suspecting that the man he'd raised as a son was driving him to his execution. O'Brien maintained his innocence until his death in February 2020 at age 86, taking whatever truth he knew to his grave in Boca Raton, Florida. The Irishman's lie that fooled millions. Frank Sheeran couldn't keep his story straight about what he ate for breakfast, but somehow convinced the world he pulled the trigger on Jimmy Hoffa. His 2004 deathbed confession, recorded by author Charles Brandt, became the book I Heard You Paint Houses, which Martin Scorsese turned into a 3.5-hour Netflix epic starring Robert De Niro. Within a month, 64 million households had watched Sheeran's version of events. The only problem was that almost none of it was true. Sheeran claimed he shot Hoffa twice in the back of the head inside a house on Beaverland Street in Detroit. The FBI tested every surface in that house with luminol, which glows when it contacts blood even after decades. They found blood, but DNA testing revealed it came from unknown individuals, not Hoffa or anyone in his family. Phone records showed Sheeran in Philadelphia that day, not Detroit. His own daughter Dolores later admitted her father had dementia when he gave his confession and often confused movie plots with real memories. The FBI received 8,400 tips in the month after The Irishman premiered on Netflix. Psychics claimed Hoffa spoke to them from beyond. Amateur detectives submitted theories based on pausing the movie at specific frames. A woman in Florida insisted her ex-husband confessed to the murder, though he was 11 years old in 1975. The Detroit FBI office had to assign 6 agents just to process the flood of useless information. The real damage was that Sheeran's fiction became fact for millions of viewers. Hollywood's version overwrote decades of FBI investigation in the public mind. The careful forensic work, the 1,000-plus witness interviews, the legitimate suspects with actual evidence against them, all got buried under Scorsese's gorgeous cinematography and De Niro's method acting. Frank Sheeran died in 2003, probably laughing that his final con job would fool more people than any lie he'd told while alive. The witness who waited 50 years. Chris Franzese had spent 50 years as the man mobsters called when they needed problems to disappear. The 93-year-old lawyer had represented Teamsters officials when Hoffa ran the union, sat in rooms with mob bosses, and fielded their calls whenever the law came knocking. His 2024 book, The Last Mob Lawyer, should have been another old man cashing in on ancient crimes. But Franzese had something nobody expected. A witness named Jeff who'd been 12 years old in 1975 and saw everything. Jeff's father operated heavy equipment at a landfill near the Pulaski Skyway in Jersey City. The kid loved watching the machines, spent summer days at the site learning to drive bulldozers. On a humid evening in late July 1975, Jeff was practicing with a front loader when a black Cadillac with Michigan plates pulled up to an excavation pit scheduled to be filled the next morning. 4 men got out. They didn't look like construction workers. The men opened the trunk and struggled with something wrapped in industrial canvas. Whatever was inside took all 4 of them to carry. They dumped it into the pit, approximately 15 feet down, then drove away without speaking to anyone. Jeff's father appeared minutes later and told his son to go home and never mention what he'd seen. The next morning, Jeff watched his father personally operate the bulldozer that filled in that section, pushing tons of garbage and dirt over whatever the men had dumped. Jeff kept quiet for 49 years. His father died in 2010. The landfill's last owner died in 2019. By 2024, when Jeff finally told Franz Blau his story, everyone who could hurt him was dead. Franz Blau says Jeff's description is more precise than anything the FBI has searched before, not just near the Pulaski Skyway, but a specific point where Broadway meets the Hackensack River, where the landfill had a natural depression that created a bowl shape perfect for hiding something permanently. The FBI searched near the Pulaski Skyway in 2021 based on a different tip and found nothing. They've heard variations of this story 7 times. Each time they dig, they find garbage, dirt, and disappointment. Franz Blau insists Jeff's spot is different, that the geography and timing match perfectly with the drive time from Detroit. The FBI hasn't responded. After spending millions of dollars digging holes based on deathbed confessions, they apparently prefer to leave this particular story buried. The hidden playing card, a cop's deathbed secret. Harold Walters kept an ace of spades tucked between Psalms and Proverbs for 22 years. When his niece Michelle found it after his funeral in 1997, the playing card had 4 lines written in black ink that made no sense to anyone. J. Hoffa, Milwaukee, third base, ballpark, 1995. The former Wisconsin police officer had never mentioned Jimmy Hoffa to his family, never talked about his past in Chicago, never explained why well-dressed men visited his trailer every year with envelopes full of cash. Walters wasn't just any cop who'd gone bad. The Chicago Police Department fired him in 1963 after catching him taking bribes from Joey Aiuppa, one of the most feared mob bosses in Illinois history. Aiuppa ran the Chicago Outfit's operations from a compound in Melrose Park, where he kept attack dogs and buried problems in the backyard. When Walters got indicted for jewelry robbery 6 months after losing his badge, Aiuppa gave him a house on his own property, right next to where he kept the dogs. The timing of Walters' move tells its own story. July 13, 1975, Hoffa disappears in Detroit. August 15, 1975, Walters suddenly abandons his Chicago life and relocates to a rusted trailer in Northwood, Wisconsin, population 237. His fishing buddies later told investigators that every summer men in expensive suits would drive 8 hours from Chicago to hand Walters envelopes. He'd brag after a few beers that he'd cased Hoffa before the disappearance, that he knew exactly where they'd put the body. Michelle Walters kept her uncle's card secret for 23 years. She'd grown up hearing stories about what happened to people who talked about mob business. But in 2020, her boyfriend Jim Zimmerman, who'd spent 40 years in law enforcement, convinced her the old mobsters were all dead or dying. The Casebreakers, a team of former FBI agents and CIA operatives who'd worked cases from the Zodiac Killer to D.B. Cooper, took the card and immediately understood what ballpark meant. Milwaukee County Stadium had been demolished in 2001, but the Casebreakers knew exactly where third base had been. They brought ground-penetrating radar that could detect disturbances 30 feet down. At the spot where third base once sat, now covered by a parking lot, the radar found something strange. 6 feet below the surface, someone had packed clay so dense it created an anaerobic environment, the kind that slows decomposition to almost nothing. Milwaukee's building department had no records of any construction at that spot. No utilities, no drainage pipes, no reason for that clay pocket to exist. Karen Corcoran brought her cadaver dog to the site without being told what they were looking for. The dog alerted 4 times, all within a 10-foot radius of where third base had been. The casebreakers presented 18 pages of evidence to the FBI in 2024, including satellite imagery showing the clay anomaly hadn't moved in 20 years. The FBI acknowledged receiving the report. They did nothing. No excavation, no soil samples, not even a courtesy visit to the site. The parade of confessions, everyone claims they did it. Over the years, plenty of people came forward with answers. Most of them were lying. Charles Allen told Congress in 1982 that Tony Provenzano had Hoffa thrown into a wood chipper and scattered across the Florida Everglades. Allen was a Teamsters official who flipped to avoid prison. But when pressed for details, he admitted he'd never actually seen it happen, just heard it from someone else. The FBI searched the Everglades for 3 months and found nothing. Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, claimed he'd stuffed Hoffa into a car trunk that got compressed at a New Jersey scrapyard. Problem: Kuklinski was in prison when Hoffa disappeared, and the scrapyard didn't open until 1978. Anthony Zerilli said Hoffa was buried under concrete at a Michigan farm. His father had been boss of the Detroit partnership and supposedly confessed on his deathbed. The FBI dug for 3 days and found nothing but tree roots. Every confession followed the same pattern. Someone with mob connections would suddenly remember crucial details decades later, usually when they needed money or attention. The media would run wild. The FBI would dig, and they'd find nothing. 7 major excavations. 7 empty holes. The FBI's own theory didn't come from confessions. It came from understanding how the mob actually worked. They believe Hoffa was incinerated at Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, Michigan, then dumped in the Detroit River. Central Sanitation Services processed industrial waste using incinerators that burned at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. A human body would reduce to bone fragments in 90 minutes. Those fragments would go through industrial crushers that could compact a Cadillac into a suitcase-sized cub. The facility operated 24 hours a day. The mob controlled it through pension fund loans since 1968. When federal investigators subpoenaed records in January 1976, all documentation from July 1975 had mysteriously disappeared. 6 months after Hoffa vanished, Central Sanitation burned to the ground. The fire started at 3:47 a.m. on January 14, 1976. By the time firefighters arrived, the heat had melted steel beams and turned concrete to powder. This matches Franzese's cryptic hint, "It's wet." Ash from an incinerated body mixed with water becomes untraceable slurry. The Detroit River sat 2 miles from Central Sanitation. Trucks dumped there legally every day. If Hoffa's remains went through those incinerators and into the river, there's nothing left to find. No DNA, no bones, no body. Just particles drifting through Lake Erie, indistinguishable from any other industrial waste that went in that night. 50 years of digging, dozens of theories, millions of dollars spent. The only consistent fact we know for sure, Hoffa is dead. Everything else, who gave the order, who pulled the trigger, and where the body went, died with the men who knew. And in the end, that might be the most mob thing about the whole story. The secret stayed secret. That's all for the Jimmy Hoffa mystery. Don't miss the videos on screen now. They're just as interesting. Catch you in the next one.